People, what are your true, scary, spooky Halloween stories that give you chills? It may be May, but it's time to jump ahead to October for some truly spooky Halloween stories. I'm here. I hope you guys can enjoy today's video. Story 1. When I was a kid, I used to go and visit my uncle's lodge during the school holidays. It was on this huge property and backed onto the edge of bushland. So my brother and I always had a whole bunch of stuff to do to keep us occupied. I remember I was with my dog one day playing near an empty creek when he suddenly just took off into the trees. Everyone else had gone into town and my dad was asleep inside. So I was pretty much alone and decided to go after him. He was much quicker than I was and I got lost pretty quickly. I was starting to get a bit upset because I couldn't find my dog and I had no idea where I was. So I turned around from where I thought I came from and tried to run back and get my dad so he could help me find him. From what I remember, I tripped over a tree root or something and fell down this embankment. I must have hit my head on something because I woke up at the bottom of this small gully, not knowing how I got there. Everything was still a bit fuzzy. What actually woke me up was my dog licking my face. He was lying down right next to me. How he found me, I don't know, but I was really happy to see him. But then he started barking. But it was a bark I hadn't really heard him do before, and he was still lying flat on his stomach. That's the strange thing I remember about that part. A really strange, lying down, grumble sort of bark. It made me scared a little bit. I turned to see what he was looking at, and there was a guy standing there. I remember he had this really faded cowboy hat thing on that had a big chunk missing on the side. "Hey, kid. You had a pretty bad fall, but you should be all right. Let me get you back to your home," he said in this really, really deep voice. Then he walked over to me, picked me up, grabbed my hand, and we started walking back through the bush. The two things I remember from that walk were holding his gloves, which I thought was weird because it was the middle of summer and really hot at the time. The other one was that my dog was walking too close to me. I was pretty much tripping the whole way back because he kept smacking into the side of my leg on the way back. The guy didn't say anything though. In fact, I don't actually remember him saying anything at all, apart from the first time he spoke. I don't think we walked for that long because we reached the creek bed really quickly, and I could hear my name being called out by my dad for dinner. I started to run up to the house and remembered I forgot to thank the guy for getting me here. So I turned to yell, "Thanks, mister." But he was already gone. I just figured he was in a hurry or something. A few days later, I was at the supermarket with my mom. It was one of the small country town ones that kind of sold everything, and everyone knows everyone else there. So I'm kind of just wandering around, and there's this photo up on the wall of this guy in a cowboy hat with a big chunk in the side missing. It was the guy who helped me in the woods. I wanted to thank him or something for helping me before. So I asked the person working there who he is. Turns out he was the original owner of the store, around 30 years ago, but died in a freak accident in the woods, where my dog and I were apparently back in the day when he used to grow vegetables for the store himself in the middle of these woods. I don't know why. I guess the soil was more fertile or something. He went one day to see how they were growing when a really bad storm started up. Apparently, he was trying to get back, but his dog, who always went with him, fell down a really steep embankment into a small gully. So this guy went after it. While he was down there, a branch broke off a tree and hit him, breaking his back. They weren't found until weeks later. His dog was also found with him, by his side. It died of starvation. That's how I found out about Mr. Rogers in any way. This one isn't creepy, it's actually so sweet. I always love a good story where the ghost or paranormal entity is truly good-hearted and is trying to help people avoid dying the way they did by helping them up. Shout out to Mr. Rogers and whatever the dog's name is. Hopefully they'll be able to move on at some point and get some rest. Story 2. I've never shared this story on the internet before. This is my genuine, terrifying childhood experience. I have my share of believable, creepy stuff that's happened to me, but this is paranormal-ish, and I'm always somewhat uneasy about sharing it because, as a skeptic, I'd normally call this kind of story BS. Just like my parents and friends would tell me. I was always the kid that made up stories, but this one is real. I shared a room with my sister around the age of 7, but she was off at a sleepover party the night it happened. As a little kid, I was terrified of lots of things. I'd never seen anything close to a horror film, not even A Nightmare Before Christmas, because of how jumpy I was. So naturally, the dark freaked me out. I was really nightmare prone, which caused everyone to say this was a dream later. But this was different. It was more vivid, too realistic to be a dream. I was hiding under my sheets like the cowardly kid I was when I decided to poke my head out to get some cool air. And I saw something in my room. Something clearly not human. I called it an alien at the time because that's the closest thing my horror-ignorant mind could liken it to. Now I see it as more similar to the Rake or the Mothman. Its head was big and egg-shaped, like those stereotypical gray aliens. Far too big for its tiny, slender body. It was totally naked, pale gray or ashen white skin. The lack of light made it hard to tell. All the bones are visible. Its tiny, shriveled sack just hung there in between its legs. Its hands were way too big for the toothpick-like arms. It was standing at a really unnatural angle. Its eyes were totally black and shiny, seemed to be the only feature on its weird head, and were sunken in little red holes. Most unsettling of all, it was just staring at me. After a few seconds of being completely paralyzed in fear, I pulled the covers back up over my head. What else could I do? I stayed there for the rest of the night until I fell asleep. I know this thing wasn't human. I told my parents the next day and they said I was dreaming. I made up a lot of stories back then. I remember a lot of them vividly, and the rest of my childhood is really, really hazy. But seeing the thing in my room is one of the childhood memories that stuck with me the most. I have no idea what it was. And despite my fascination with horror stories, I don't think I want to know. It's so weird that whatever creature that was, let's call it an alien, was just in OP's room and not seemingly there for any reason. Maybe it was just a kid freaking out and seeing stuff in the dark, which I'm a little more inclined to believe since OP didn't mention anything, saying they heard when the alien came in or left. Story 3. This is totally true. Maybe not very spectacular, but a creepy thought nonetheless. When I was in high school, the drama department set up a haunted house for Halloween. It was generally pretty mediocre. For a play they'd recently done, they had a cable hanging from the stage ceiling, to which you could wear a harness and hang there. That the cable was attached to fake for a scene in which someone is hung in the play. Only fake in that it didn't cinch up when you put weight on it. But it also didn't have any give, basically. As long as the harness held you up, the noose fell loose around your neck. Really a stupid idea in retrospect. Naturally, this was implemented into the haunted house, and I volunteered to play a hanging trick-or-treater. I wore a dinosaur outfit and held a bag of candy and pretended to be dead and hung there. At one point, I took a break as the harness was riding up in no-no places. And while I was gone, some idiot took the liberty of grabbing the noose and swinging around the stage from it. This somehow tightened the noose without my knowing, and when I returned, I put the mask on. Stepped up on a ladder, connected my harness, put the noose around my neck, and let myself hang. The noose tightened around my neck, cutting off the circulation and air, and immediately I began to black out. I felt myself falling asleep comfortably, and only after a few seconds did it occur to me what was happening. I suddenly remembered that I was hanging there and blindly reached out for the ladder. I pulled myself onto it and relieved the pressure on my throat. My nerves were going nuts and I was shaking because my head hurts. So I stood there for a moment, took off the noose and harness, and walked away. I'm certain I could have easily hung myself accidentally then and there, and it's clear what would have resulted. Every year, new students would recount the legend of the one drama student that hung there for hours in the school's haunted house, while families paraded past him, unaware that the dead trick-or-treater they were ogling was actually dead. He was only to be discovered by his poor girlfriend at the end of the night. Despite consistent denial by faculty, the legend would persist. OP, I'm happy you're okay, but it's so cool to me to think that there's this local legend going around about someone dying a really gruesome way. But it turns out that it was actually just OP, who was put in a potentially fatal situation. Even though the original story is really cool, I do think the legend is arguably a lot freakier. Story 4. When I was younger, we frequently visited my grandparents around holidays, even though we don't live in the same town. My aunt lived 2 houses down from my grandparents. The lady in the house was creepy. She was a large woman, over 6 feet tall. She wore logging chains around her neck, a dress, and work boots. The only time I remember seeing her outside was either in her garden or when she was washing the outside of her house, scrubbing the actual building. She did this often. During these times, she would yell at us kids and call us all kinds of things. She would tell us the devil would be coming for us. The adults told us to leave her alone and to avoid her. We would run the distance between my aunts and my grandparents because when you passed by, she was watching out the windows. It was creepy and we never went alone. One Halloween, one of the cousins dared us to trick-or-treat her house. Remember how scared I was, but I didn't want to be a chicken. Plus, I was going with a group. One of us rang the doorbell and there were a lot of banging noises in the house, suddenly like door slamming. When she answered the door, she had a severed head in her hands and we all went screaming. The adults told us it was a Halloween prop and we knew we shouldn't be bothering her and deserved to be scared. About a month later, my parents got a phone call that the lady had tried to kill my aunt while she was bringing in groceries and had my young cousin in her arms. The lady had one of the rope saws and had come up behind my aunt with it. She put it over her head and around her neck and proceeded to saw. My aunt naturally flipped and started kicking the door. My uncle came and beat the lady down with a fire poker. The police investigation revealed that the woman had been digging tunnels into her home, which were coming up under my aunts, my grandparents, and another neighbor's house. She'd been bringing the dirt up and putting it in the raised beds of the garden. She also had a shrine of some sort underground, which had a few severed heads around it. My aunt survived, by the way, but has a long scar across her neck. Story 5. Okay, this is 100% true, even though people I tell this to in real life don't believe me. When I was really little, my parents would let me stay up late on the weekends and watch TV until I fell asleep. I really loved these times, and I would stay up later than anybody else just because I could. Well, one night I was almost asleep on the couch when I heard a noise on our front porch. It was the sound of our old-fashioned porch swing moving back and forth. I was a little scared, so I crept toward the bay windows of my living room and peeked out towards the porch. Sitting on my front porch swing was an older woman, probably in her 50s, wearing nothing but a nightgown, covered in blood, and holding a huge kitchen knife. I flipped out immediately and ran screaming into my parents' room, but was too terrified to form words. My parents saw that I was upset. When I was finally able to tell them what I saw, my dad got really angry and told me that it was just a dream and to go back to bed. I refused and kept crying and screaming until he had had enough and snatched my arm and dragged me toward the front door to prove that nothing was there. I kicked and screamed all the way, trying to make him stop, but he kept pulling me. Finally, we got to the door. He unlocked it, swung it open, and said, "See, there's nothing there," before he cut himself off. I have never seen the look of fear and shock that was on his face when that woman turned and stared at both of us and slowly stood up with a knife. My dad slammed the door and got my mom to call the police while he went and got his gun. He went back to the door with a 12 gauge and cracked the door enough to stick the barrel out. He asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Somebody killed my husband, but it wasn't me." My dad told her that the police were coming, and she freaked out, grabbed the knife, and walked away. The police found her 15 minutes later trying to break into one of our neighbors' houses. I never slept in the living room again. I know parents are scared of their kids lying and telling stories, but I hope this was a bit of a wake-up call to your parents to start listening to you when you tried to tell them stuff. I do wonder if the lady was going to try and break into Opie's house if they hadn't called the cops, or if she was just going to leave at some point when she got bored of sitting on that swing. Story 6. When I was about 6 or 7, my family decided to go on summer vacation up to a little island in Maine. We rented out this old house in the water. From what I can remember, there are about 6 to 7 other houses on the island. Everyone else who lived there was in their 60s, plus years of age, except for the mid-40s man who fished on the water. His name was Bubba. I crap you not. Anyway, the island was exceedingly creepy. Everything about the house was really old. Every piece of furniture from that house was probably over 60 years old. Not to mention there was no television. Running water was used through a well in the pump. Hundreds of books and pictures in the house dated through at least the last 100 years. To make things more pant-poopingly creepy, there was an infestation of rats in the backyard that would run around at night. Also, whenever we made dinner, all of the old ladies who lived in the houses on the island somehow knew and would show up and give us a blueberry pie and fresh-caught bluefish. It was really creepy. It was as if everyone knew what we were doing and when we did it. Long story short, a few nights into our stay at this house, my parents started hearing singing at night. They said it would start and stop for about 20 to 30 minutes the first few nights. I didn't think much of it. The following day, they passed around, but they couldn't find the source of the singing. The second to last night of our week-long stay, my whole family heard the singing, and we went outside to find out what was going on. It sounded like a choir of children. It really freaked all of us out, but we didn't want to ruin the trip. It was just very mysterious. The next day, my dad starts checking out some of the old photos and books in the library and finds this old scrapbook dated to the early 1920s. The house we were living in was once an old schoolhouse, and there's a picture of the boys' choir. We all pooped bricks and left the next day. Story 7. I grew up in a haunted house, so I have many of these stories. The house was 3 stories and 5,000 square feet. It was moderately new, built in the 60s, located in the middle of the woods. Creepy enough without the haunted part. One time we were all watching TV downstairs in the basement, basically just the ground level floor at the bottom of the house. The kitchen is right above the TV room. It's nearly 10 p.m. All of a sudden we hear what sounds like a man with work boots on, stomping through the kitchen. We pause the movie and all look at each other like, ugh, no, not this again. My grandpa tells us to stay downstairs. He goes upstairs and returns about 5 minutes later. All the doors are locked, all the lights are off. There's no one in the house. We all just stare at each other and completely freaked out and resume watching the movie. When I was little, I used to see black figures walking around the upstairs section of the house. We had this balcony thing that overlooked the library/conversation room. That balcony connected to my grandparents' room. The room connected to a bathroom. The bathroom connected to the sewing room. And the sewing room connected to the staircase landing. That connected to the other side of the balcony. So it was all a big loop. That floor in itself was haunted as all hell. When me and my sister used to use the bathroom, we went together in case something bad happened. One time we were in my grandparents' bathroom and she was peeing. I was standing next to the sink and saw something move out of the corner of my eye. In my grandparents' bedroom doorway. I looked and saw a huge black figure walking around the room. I started screaming, "Black thing, black thing." My sister and I jumped up and ran through the sewing room towards the stairs. As we were running, we heard the black thing running through the bedroom and across the balcony. We could hear it running behind us as we went down the stairs. Then it stopped once we reached the kitchen. Crazy. It sounds like the house itself was beautiful, but just terrifying to live in. I wonder if OP or their sister ever looked up the address of the place, and if they did they find anything about murders or crimes happening in that house, or on the land it was built, to explain what kept happening? Story 8. This is a true story. My roommate, we'll call him Steven, had a pretty big party for his 30th birthday. There's cake, balloons, weed, and booze. We were having a great time when one of Steven's friends tells him he'll give him $100 to go to the casino and gamble, but he has to go gamble with him. My roommate says, hell yeah. They get ready to leave. So does everyone else and the party ends. So eventually everyone leaves and it's just me. I clean up a bit, turn all the lights off in the apartment except my bedroom light, get into my nightwear, and sit on my bed to watch some TV. So I'm sitting there, I keep hearing this dragging noise, followed 15 seconds later by a light plop. This goes on for 25 to 30 minutes, but I don't do anything out of the ordinary. So I figure maybe it's something going wrong with the fish tank. I keep hearing this for 15 more minutes. Think nothing of it. Once a movement by my bedroom door catches my attention. One of the balloons we use for the party, a big number 0, is sitting at the threshold on my door, seemingly appearing out of nowhere. I just stared at it like, WTF? Then, as if on cue, it moves inside my room, dragging the plastic bottom on the ground about half a foot, floats up around half a foot, floats forward to the door very slowly, and plops the weight back down on the ground. Then it just sits there, doing nothing. And a few minutes later, it would repeat it. All this time, I'm sitting there horrified. The balloon continues to move toward me in my bed until it plops right down at the edge of my bed, kind of leans right in my face. I jumped up and backed away, searching for a logical explanation for what I just observed. Story 9. Anyway, I grew up in a small town in Kansas that I have since gotten the duck out of. The town had tons of meth-addicted trailer trash. One time, a good friend of mine spotted some creepy abandoned house on some off-road, several miles outside of town. We were ducking stupid and decided to check it out. You could tell it was abandoned because the windows were all busted out and all that. The front door was jammed shut, but we managed to get in by shoving ourselves into it hard enough. The house smelled like chemicals. I'm not sure how else to describe it, but the air kind of stung your nose very slightly when you breathed in. One thing I saw but never gave a second thought to until later was a metal can full of rocks with the string cutting across about a foot above foot level in a doorway. We just stepped over it. We eventually made our way upstairs. There's broken glass all up the stairs and cracked loudly as we walk up. Yes, I know at this point, we are gonna think we're dumb as hell for not getting the heck out of there. And you were absolutely correct. But we were some dumb 16-year-olds who were a bit too curious. Anyway, at the top of the stair, we saw some scary as hell junkie. He was holding a handgun. He was freaking out and screaming crap at us. We ran the freak out of there. Turns out we stumbled into a meth lab. I drove past the place a couple years ago, and the house has been torn down. Scariest thing that's happened to me, though. Hey, at least you guys didn't run into Walter White. I'm not sure if you did, you'd be able to tell the tale today. Story 10. When I was a kid, I had an imaginary friend named Jesse. I don't really remember much about him, but I remember my parents asking about him quite a lot and seeming quite concerned. Anyway, a couple of years ago while visiting relatives in Ireland, we were all exchanging ghost stories. My family has a lot of creepy crap happening to them. When my mom brought up Jesse, I was obviously quite confused because I thought he was just an imaginary friend. Well, my mom started off by saying how she didn't understand why I called him Jesse, as I'd never heard the name before and she didn't know anyone who was called that, which I didn't think was too weird. It's just a name, right? Then she said that one time when my dad was on his way to work, He was an electrician in a mine at the time. I'd asked him to bring back coal for Jesse's grandfather. I was about 2/3 of the time and wouldn't have understood what a mine was if I even knew he worked in one. Then the end of her story was when we were on a day trip to a place we visited a lot when I was really young. I suddenly just ran off and they followed me into a graveyard. I ran straight to a small grave and stopped and just stared at it. It was Jesse's grave. I felt quite creeped out that I spent a lot of time as a child playing with a ghost. Story 11. When I was about 13, my mom and dad invited our previous neighbors from the block of flats we lived in, until I was 5 years old. Anyway, I'd been sent to bed but could still hear everyone talking about this, and that until the woman neighbor said, "Hey, Opie's mom, do you remember when Opie used to complain that there was someone in his room? Well, there's a family that's just moved into the floor above who have a 3-year-old son. He's complaining of the exact same things Opie did." This creeped me out. I had no recollection of any of this, so the next day I asked my mom. Her first reaction was, "You don't remember?" Then she told me all about the weird stuff that used to happen. Footsteps up and down the hall, stuff going missing and stuff. She said the final thing to happen was when she was listening to a record one day, and it started to slow down. Like someone was holding a finger gently on the platter till it finally came to a stop. My mom said she snapped at this point and started shouting, "Will you leave us the freak alone?" As soon as she said this, the record went straight back to playing normally. We never ever experienced anything again. I've never experienced anything like that since, and these days I'm quite skeptical of such stories, but I believe my mom. Strangest thing is how I found out about it from someone else 10 years later experiencing something similar. Story 12. I'm a kid who likes to sleep very much, so my dad often had to wake me up as I slept through my alarm. He wakes me up the same way every time by gently putting a hand on my shoulder, and then since I usually plead for 5 more minutes, he yanks the covers off and forces me up. So a few weeks ago, I did get up very early to go play pickup basketball in the morning with some friends. I set my alarm the night before and went to sleep. My dad works very far away, so he often sleeps at work 2 or 3 nights a week. He wasn't sleeping at home, so I knew I had to get myself up. I eventually fall asleep and then I wake up to a hand on my shoulder, murmur the usual 5 more minutes. And then I feel the covers yanking off me all the way off the bed. I shot up out of bed because it was a habit at this point, because this is when I knew my dad was serious. I opened my eyes and it was pitch black in my room and nobody was there. I looked around and saw nothing, just the lights on my clock that said it was 2:30 in the morning. I was a little more than slightly freaked out. I asked my mom in the morning if my dad had come home, but she said no. He had stayed at work. Story 13. My family has lived in rural Nebraska since they immigrated from Germany in the mid-1800s. Near the turn of the century, disease was pretty rampant in the homesteading area, and it killed members of almost every family. When someone died from illness, time was of the essence in burying them, so as to not let the virus spread from the deceased to the living. This meant no wake periods. So an aunt of some unknown number of greats preceding her relationship to me dies of some disease and she gets buried in the family cemetery under the homestead. The dogs were very fond of her, so it wasn't too surprising that after the funeral, the dogs stuck near the grave. The rest of the family began to think something of it when, a week and a half later, the dogs were still visiting her grave almost constantly. But they weren't just at the grave. They were visibly distressed, frantic, and often barking while there. This goes on for maybe 2 weeks when the family decides to check it out. They dig the casket up and open it. The deceased's hair has all been pulled out. Her fingers are raw and bloody and mangled from wear. On the inside of the casket door, they can see deep scratches in the wood. She was comatose when they buried her, and she came underground, spending probably her last 5 days or so alive in a buried casket. This is honestly one of my greatest fears, and I know it's not that realistic, considering how in-depth the autopsy checks are and what they have to do to legally pronounce you as dead. Compare this to what they probably did in the 1800s, where if you stop breathing heavily or moving for too long, you're dead. Even knowing this though, I'm terrified that someone is gonna pronounce me as dead and they won't know until I'm on the autopsy table, where they actually kill me. Story 14. I was raccoon hunting with my uncle in the woods of southern Ohio. These lights and noises came out of nowhere and they seemed to pin us down. The redbones, raccoon hounds, went silent and cried on the ground. They're not afraid of bears or anything I've seen, as the heavy fog rolled onto us and we were almost frozen. 2 seconds later, it was all gone. The fog and everything. The dogs were still freaked out, so we knew it was not just us. I was 12, so I was not drunk or on drugs. Creeps me out to this day.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.